As a Protestant, I find myself in deep disagreement with my Catholic and Orthodox friends over questions like those of Marianism or other serious questions of faith. As a side note, one of the things that Solon did that we didn't mention is he made it, he made it illegal to keep out of a public conflict so that everybody would have a stake in some sort of major public fight. Repeatedly, their answer is that Protestantism is not the religion of the Church Fathers, which seems to be mostly true with the caveat that most Protestant ideas existed within the Church Fathers in some form. How do you defend your faith from accusations of heresy or falsity, especially as large sections of the Church appear to be atrophying or breaking down? Does modern Protestantism suffer from being detached to apostolic succession? Well, this is a serious problem, and Protestantism has a lot to answer for, right? We see a lot of problems in the Protestant Church. I would note, by the way, that the Catholic Church is not exempt from this. The woke takeover of Catholic churches is also very real and proceeds apace. So the record on this is sort of spotty on both sides, and I would suggest that is one way into answering this question. Because when we look at something like wokeness, what we're dealing with is a Western problem and a church-wide problem, right? We are dealing with something that has affected all forms of life and worship in the West. And so I wouldn't hold Protestantism's devolution into wokeness against it, in part because it's not unique to Protestantism. In some sense, wokeness is a virulent, degraded strain of Protestantism, but that's not the only thing it is. It's also Marxism, right? It's also any number of other. It has any number of other strands of intellectual DNA, and so then we get to this apostolic succession question, and to me, it's key what you say that a lot of the Protestant ideas that people like Luther and Calvin were defending existed within the Church Fathers. And we actually had a whole conversation on Locals about sola fide and the minutiae, right, of what was really being argued over. Because in fact, the idea that faith saves, right, was well present in the church, right? Really what you're looking at in the Protestant Reformation is you're looking at a claim that these ancient ideas, which have existed throughout the history of Christendom, have gradually become corrupt and taken on unnecessary accretions, including things like indulgences, right? And so to say that the Church Fathers were Catholic, or some of them Greek Orthodox, right? But to say that the Church Fathers were Catholic is true in a sense. But it's also not true in the sense that the question had not yet been posed, right? And the crisis in the history of Christianity that was going on at the time, which was also a crisis in epistemology, right? How do we know things? And an authority. How do we know absolute truth? That crisis was not going to not occur, right? It was inevitable to anybody who had eyes to see. There were obvious problems with putting men in charge of religious institutions, or at least giving men final authority over religious institutions. And so I would suggest that Protestants are definitely guilty of jettisoning the Church Fathers or ignoring their wisdom or saying all sorts of things that would make any number of Church Fathers into heretics, right? We do get overly dogmatic about these things in sola scriptura, meaning that only the letter of Scripture can ever, can interpret itself, and it's fully self-sufficient, right? These things don't really hold up under scrutiny, and we say them only because we're getting worked up into a froth, right? The actual debates are much more subtle than that. They have to do, for instance, with forgiveness, right? Who can offer and receive and ask for forgiveness from God, right? Does it come direct, or does it come mediated by a priest? And in that sense, right, there's all sorts of discussion of these questions in the tradition. It faces a crisis that hadn't yet come into being. And so to retroject that crisis backward and to claim Augustine or Aquinas for Catholicism over Protestantism, or for Protestantism over Catholicism, seems anachronistic to me. I would say that we should argue the argument that we're having, right, from the perspective that it's been had over the last several hundred years, right? The question has to do with authority, right? Where does authority come from? How do we know? How do we connect? How do we know that we are speaking to God or encountering God and not just putting our own words into God's mouth? And that that is a question to which Protestants and Catholics have very, very different answers. But it doesn't. It's not the same kind of question as like, are you a heretic? Right? Have you diverged from the true faith by having a different answer about Mary than the Pope? Right? It seems to me like that gets the question wrong at a number of different levels. And I would suggest, asking these fundamental epistemological questions, right? Well, so what exactly is it about the church, right, the Pope, that makes him the bearer of, the final word on this tradition in the last analysis? Those sorts of questions, I think, are much more contemporary than the things that, yes, have been said in the tradition. Things like, faith saves, right, have been part of the tradition, and the relationship between faith and works have been part of the Christian tradition forever. It's just that they came to a crisis. All forms of knowing, right, came to a crisis during this time. And so I would say we're not heretics any more than the Catholics are. We are having a debate within Christianity about how best to carry forward the history up to the point of the eruption of that debate.